Commander Vexnar had never known fear in his entire life, and he was proud of this fact, for his species had removed that weak emotion from their blood many generations ago, believing it made them lesser beings, and now they stood as the greatest conquerors the galaxy had ever seen. The Kelthari Dominion had taken 47 worlds across 3 star systems, and not once had any of their warriors felt the cold grip of terror that other species seemed to suffer, because they had evolved beyond such primitive feelings. Or so they believed with absolute certainty. Vexnar stood 8 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms and an armored shell that covered his body like natural battle armor. And his kind had been hunters on their homeworld long before they learned to build ships that could cross the stars. So conquering other species came as naturally to them as breathing. His ship, the Voidfang, was a dreadnought of immense power, carrying weapons that could crack planets, and shields that could withstand the heat of a dying star. And today it led a fleet of 12 such vessels toward a small blue world that the locals called Earth. The humans who lived on this world had only been traveling through space for about 200 years, which was nothing compared to the thousands of years the Kelthari had spent among the stars, and their technology was supposed to be primitive and weak, according to every report Vexnar had received. Sub-Officer Thrix stood beside him on the bridge, her mandibles clicking with anticipation as she watched the tactical display, showing the human fleet gathered in orbit around their planet. And she counted 47 vessels of different sizes, none of which looked particularly threatening. "Commander," she said with excitement in her voice, "the humans have assembled their entire defense force, and it appears they mean to fight us rather than surrender, which seems foolish, given our obvious superiority." Vexnar studied the enemy ships on his screen and found them ugly and awkward, with exposed hull plates and strange configurations that made no sense to his tactical mind. And he wondered why any species would build such fragile-looking vessels when they knew war was coming. "Open a channel to their flagship," he ordered, "and let us give them the chance to submit before we are forced to destroy them, for I am not without mercy when dealing with lesser beings who know their place." The view screen flickered and then showed a human face, which Vexnar found strangely smooth and soft compared to the hard shells of his own people. And the creature had short dark hair and brown eyes that seemed to hold no fear whatsoever. "I am Admiral Linda Morgan of the United Earth Defense Force," the human female said in a steady voice, "and you are violating our territory, so I must ask you to turn your ships around and leave our space immediately." His mandibles twitched with amusement at her boldness, for surely she must understand that her small fleet had no hope against his mighty dreadnoughts, and yet she spoke as if she were the one in control of this situation. "I am Commander Vexnar of the Kelthari Dominion," he replied, "and your species has been chosen for integration into our empire, which means you will surrender your planet, your resources, and your people to us, or we will simply take them by force and leave nothing but ashes behind." The human admiral did not flinch or look away, and her expression remained as calm as still water, which Vexnar found curious, because every other species had shown at least some reaction to his threats in the past. "We decline your generous offer," she said, with what might have been sarcasm. "And if you try to take our world by force, we will defend ourselves with everything we have, and I promise you that the cost will be higher than you expect." "This fight," Vexnar told her plainly, "because our weapons are more powerful than yours, our shields are stronger than yours, and our ships are faster than yours. So this is not a battle you can hope to survive, let alone win." Admiral Morgan leaned forward slightly, and something changed in her eyes, something that Vexnar could not quite identify, that made him feel strangely uncomfortable for reasons he did not understand. "Commander," she said in a quiet voice that somehow seemed more dangerous than shouting, "you have made a terrible mistake coming here, and I think you will realize this very soon. because you do not understand what humans are, or what we are capable of doing when someone threatens our home. Vexnar waited for her to continue, and she did not disappoint him. You think you know us because you have studied our broadcasts, and our history, and our communications, she went on. But you have completely misread everything you have seen, because we are not a peaceful species that learned to fight out of necessity. No, we are a violent species that learned peace out of desperation, and war is not something new to us. Her voice grew colder with every word. War is what we have always done best, Commander, and we have been fighting each other for thousands of years before we even knew your kind existed. So you are not bringing anything to us that we have not already survived 100 times over. She paused for just a moment before delivering her final words. You have 47 worlds, but we have only one. And I want you to understand something very clearly before you make your next decision. Because we will burn this entire galaxy to ashes before we let anyone take our home from us. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Vexnar staring at a blank screen, with a strange feeling growing in his chest. Something he had never experienced before, and could not name. Uncertainty in her eyes, which was also unusual, because his sub-officer had always been confident and eager for battle. But something about the human admiral's words had affected her as well. Commander, she asked hesitantly, what are your orders now that the humans have refused to surrender and have threatened to fight us to the death? Vexnar pushed away the uncomfortable feeling in his chest and straightened his posture, reminding himself that he was a warrior of the Dominion and that no primitive species could possibly defeat his fleet, no matter how brave or foolish they might be. Begin the attack, he commanded, and show these humans what happens to those who dare to defy the Kelthari Dominion, for they will learn the price of their arrogance in blood and fire. The Void Fang's engines roared to life as the great dreadnought surged forward, and the rest of the fleet followed close behind, 12 ships of destruction heading toward the small blue planet. Where humanity waited. Vexnar had no way of knowing that this day would change everything he believed about strength and weakness, courage and fear, and that the lessons he was about to learn would haunt him for the rest of his very long life. The humans watched the Kelthari fleet approach, and they did not run or hide or beg for mercy. Because running and hiding and begging were not things that humans did when their home was threatened. And Admiral Linda Morgan gave her own orders with a calm voice that masked the fire burning in her heart. All ships, she said over the fleet-wide channel, this is Admiral Morgan, and the enemy is coming, so let us show them what humanity is made of, and let us make them regret the day they ever heard the name Earth. The battle for humanity's survival was about to begin. The Kelthari fleet moved into attack formation with practiced precision, spreading out in a wide arc to surround the human defenders, and Vexnar watched from his command throne as his ships prepared to unleash destruction upon the tiny blue world. He had done this many times before, against many different species, and it had always ended the same way, with the enemy broken and burning, while the Kelthari claimed another world for their growing empire. Weapons range in 30 seconds, Thrix reported from their station, her claws dancing across the control panels as she prepared the Void Fang's massive plasma batteries for firing. Target the largest human vessel first, Vexnar ordered, and once we destroy their command ship, the rest of their fleet will lose all hope and scatter like frightened animals. The largest human ship was a bulky vessel with the name USS Valor painted on its hull in bold white letters, and Vexnar could see rows of escape pods along its sides, which told him that the humans expected to lose their ships and had planned for their crews to abandon them. This seemed like weakness to him, because Kelthari warriors would never think of escape when battle was joined, and they would fight to the death in their posts without ever considering surrender or retreat. Weapons range achieved, Thrix announced, and all batteries are ready to fire on your command, so say the word, and we will turn their flagship into dust. Fire, Vexnar said simply. The Void Fang shuddered as its plasma batteries unleashed a torrent of superheated energy at the human flagship, and for a moment, the USS Valor disappeared completely in a blaze of brilliant light that filled the view screen. But when the light faded and Vexnar could see again, the human ship was still there, apparently undamaged and still holding its position in the defensive line. Report, he demanded, because this should not have been possible, according to everything he knew about human technology. Direct hit confirmed on target, Thrix said with confusion in her voice. But their shields absorbed the entire impact somehow, and I do not understand how this can be, because our plasma batteries should be able to penetrate any shield technology they could possibly possess. Before Vexnar could respond to this unexpected development, the human fleet opened fire, and suddenly the Void Fang was shaking violently as something struck its forward shields with tremendous force. Then it shook again, and warning lights began flashing across the bridge as damage reports started flooding in from all sections of the ship. "What is happening?" Vexnar demanded, gripping the arms of his throne to keep himself steady as another impact rocked the vessel. "They are using kinetic weapons," Thrix reported with something strange in her voice that sounded almost like panic. "And they are firing magnetically. Accelerated solid projectiles at incredibly high speeds, and our shields are not stopping them, because our shields were designed to block energy weapons." Another impact tore through the ship somewhere below the bridge, and Vexnar could hear the terrible sound of metal being ripped apart by forces it was never meant to withstand. "Kinetic weapons are primitive," he said in disbelief, "and no advanced civilization uses them anymore, because energy weapons are superior in every way. So how can simple metal projectiles be causing us so much damage?" "I am also detecting missiles and torpedoes," Thrix continued, her voice rising higher with each word. "And they appear to be carrying nuclear warheads, Commander. The humans are using nuclear weapons in space combat." Vexnar stared at the tactical display as his perfect fleet began to take damage from every direction, and he could not understand what he was seeing, because none of this made any sense according to plan. Everything the Dominion knew about warfare. The humans had not developed sophisticated energy weapons or advanced defensive systems like every other spacefaring species, and instead they had taken the primitive technologies that the Kelthari ancestors had abandoned thousands of years ago, and refined them into something terrifyingly effective. A Kelthari dreadnought on the left side of the formation reported catastrophic damage to its engines, and Vexnar watched on his screen as human ships closed in around the wounded vessel like predators surrounding injured prey. "They are not accepting surrender signals," Frick said, with genuine fear now audible in her voice. "And they are not attempting to capture our ship. They are simply firing until there is nothing left." The crippled dreadnought exploded in a brilliant flash of light, and 2,000 Kelthari warriors died in an instant, killed by a species that was supposed to be too primitive to pose any real threat. Something was happening to Vexnar that he did not understand, and his heart began to beat faster in his chest, while his mandibles trembled slightly, and a cold sensation spread through his body that made his thoughts scattered and difficult to focus. His species had removed this feeling from their genetic code many generations ago, but apparently they had not removed it completely, because some ancient part of his brain that was older than civilization itself still remembered what terror felt like. "Commander," Frick said urgently, "another dreadnought has been destroyed, and the humans are not slowing down their attack. What are your orders?" Vexnar tried to speak but found that words would not come easily, because he was experiencing something that no Kelthari had felt in centuries, and he did not know how to process it or push it aside. Fear had found Commander Vexnar, and it was spreading through his crew like a disease, on his ship, with an emotion they had been taught to believe was impossible for their kind. The battle continued to rage around them, and more Kelthari ships fell to the relentless human assault, and Vexnar realized with growing horror that his fleet was actually losing this fight against a species they had expected to crush in minutes. He watched a human destroyer that had been badly damaged by plasma fire suddenly change course and accelerate directly toward one of his dreadnoughts, and he understood with sick certainty what was about to happen. "They are ramming us!" Thrix screamed. "The humans are using their own ships as weapons and crashing them into our vessels." The destroyer struck the dreadnought at full speed, and both ships disappeared in a massive explosion that sent debris flying in all directions. And Vexnar saw escape pods launching from other human ships. Tiny capsules carrying survivors who had chosen to live rather than die. Survivors would be picked up by their comrades and returned to the fight, and their knowledge and experience would make them even more dangerous the next time. While every Kelthari who died was gone forever. The humans were not just fighting to win, they were fighting to survive, and there was something in that desperation that made them stronger than any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. "Commander," Thrix pleaded, "we need orders. What do we do? How do we fight an enemy that does not care if they die?" Vexnar finally found his voice, though it sounded strange and weak even to his own ears. "All ships concentrate fire on the human vessels," he commanded, "and overwhelm their shields with sustained bombardment. We have more firepower than they do, so we will simply destroy them through sheer force." But even as he gave the order, he knew in his heart that something had changed forever. Because he had learned a terrible truth about the universe that his species had forgotten long ago. Fear was not weakness, and removing it had not made the Kelthari stronger. And now they were facing an enemy who embraced their terror and used it as fuel for their fury. The battle was far from over, but Vexnar already knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The battle had been raging for 6 terrible hours, and Vexnar could barely recognize his once mighty fleet as he stared at the tactical display with exhausted eyes. His 12 dreadnoughts had been reduced to 7, then 5, then 3, and the survivors were badly damaged and running low on ammunition, while the humans kept fighting, with a ferocity that seemed to have no limit. The humans had lost ships as well, their fragile vessels crumbling under Kelthari plasma fire when the weapons found their mark. But something about them was different from any enemy Vexnar had ever faced. When a Kelthari ship was destroyed, the crew died at their posts without complaint, accepting their fate with the calm acceptance that their species was famous for, because that was what warriors without fear were supposed to do. But when human ships were crippled, the survivors did not simply wait for death to take them, and instead they ejected in escape pods or sealed themselves in surviving sections of their ships and called for rescue, or they turned their dying vessels into weapons and crashed them into Kelthari dreadnoughts. One human pilot named Kevin, according to the communications that Thrix had intercepted, had ejected from his destroyed fighter and drifted in space near a Kelthari supply ship without being noticed by the crew. The recordings showed him using his suit's small thrusters to reach the supply ship's hull, and then using a simple cutting tool to break through an airlock, and then entering the vessel alone with nothing but a small gun and a knife. 20 minutes later, the supply ship's reactor exploded, destroying the vessel and damaging 2 nearby dreadnoughts, and this single human had accomplished more destruction than an entire squadron of Kelthari fighters could have managed. This was what fear gave the humans, Vexnar realized with growing dread, because the knowledge that death was coming made them desperate and creative and willing to do things that no rational being would ever consider. "Commander," Thrix said in a hollow voice, "we are receiving another transmission from the human flagship." "Put it on screen," Vexnar replied, though he was not sure he wanted to hear what Admiral Morgan had to say. The human admiral appeared on the view screen, looking battered and bloody, with bruises on her face and dark stains on her uniform. But her eyes were exactly the same as before, steady and cold and completely unafraid. "Commander Vexnar," she said in a calm voice, Your fleet has lost 75% of its vessels, and you have caused significant damage to our forces as well. But I must inform you that reinforcements from our inner colonies will arrive in approximately 4 hours. Vexnar said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he knew that his remaining ships could not survive another 6 hours of combat, even if the Admiral was lying about the reinforcements. I am offering you the opportunity to withdraw from our space, Morgan continued, and you may take your surviving ships and leave. And if you do this, and never return, we will not pursue you or seek revenge for this attack. This was not what Vexnar had expected, and he found himself asking a question before he could stop himself. Why would you offer us mercy when you clearly have the advantage? He demanded. Because your species should want to destroy us completely to eliminate us as a future threat. Admiral Morgan's expression changed slightly, and for just a moment she looked almost sad rather than victorious. Because we know what you are, Commander, she said quietly, and we have studied your species very carefully since we first learned of your existence, and we understand what you did to yourselves when you removed fear from your people. She paused and seemed to be choosing her next words with great care. That fear made you weak, but you were wrong, because fear is not weakness at all, and it never was, because fear is wisdom that tells you when to fight and when to run away and live to fight another day. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more intense. Without fear, you cannot recognize when you have made a terrible mistake until it is far too late to fix it. And that is exactly what happened to you today, because you came here expecting easy prey and found something very different. Vexnar felt the cold sensation in his chest growing stronger as he listened to her words, and he understood that she was right about everything she was saying. We are offering you the chance to learn from this experience, Morgan said, and we are offering you the chance to be afraid, because fear might save your species from making the same mistake again in the future. The transmission ended, and Vexnar sat in silence on his command throne, while his bridge crew waited for orders with obvious uncertainty in their movements. The strange feeling that had been growing inside him throughout the battle was stronger now, and he could see that his officers were experiencing the same thing, because they moved hesitantly and looked at each other with expressions that the Kelthari were not supposed to be capable of showing. Fear was contagious, apparently, and the humans had returned this ancient emotion to the Kelthari in a single devastating battle. Commander, Thrix said quietly, what are your orders? Because we need to decide whether to continue fighting or accept the human offer of withdrawal. Vexnar thought about his homeworld and the Dominion High Council that ruled it. And he thought about the shame of returning in defeat after losing 9 dreadnoughts to a species that was supposed to be primitive and weak. He thought about the 47 worlds the Dominion had conquered, and all the species that had submitted to Kelthari rule without any real resistance, and he realized that none of them had been anything like the humans. Every other species had recognized Kelthari superiority and had chosen to surrender rather than fight a hopeless battle. But the humans had not done this, and instead they had stood their ground and fought back with everything they had. And they had won. Set course for Dominion space, Vexnar finally said, and maximum speed. Commander, Thrix replied with surprise in her voice, the High Council will not accept retreat as an option, and they will demand that you return here and complete the conquest of Earth, no matter the cost. Then they can come here themselves and learn what we have learned today, Vexnar responded, because I will not sacrifice what remains of this fleet in a battle we cannot win against an enemy we do not understand. The 3 surviving Kelthari dreadnoughts turned away from Earth and began the long journey back to Dominion space, leaving behind the wreckage of their fallen comrades and the bodies of thousands of warriors who had died believing themselves invincible. Behind them, the battered human fleet held position in orbit around their world, watching the enemy retreat but not celebrating their victory, because they knew this was only the beginning. Admiral Linda Morgan stood on the bridge of the USS Valor and watched the Kelthari ships disappear into the darkness of space. And she allowed herself a small sigh of relief that the immediate threat was over. But she also knew that the Dominion would not accept this defeat quietly, and that larger fleets would come in the future, and that humanity would need to be ready for whatever came next. "Begin recovery operations for all escape pods," she ordered her crew, "and start repairs on every ship that can be saved, because we have won this battle, but the war is just beginning." The humans had proven themselves against a superior enemy, and they had done it by embracing the fear that their opponents had foolishly discarded. Fear had made them stronger, and it would continue to make them stronger in the battles yet to come. 3 weeks after the battle for Earth, Commander Vexnar stood before the Dominion High Council on the throne world of Keltar Prime, and he had never felt so small in his entire life. The council chamber was enormous, carved from living stone that had taken generations to shape, and the walls glowed with bioluminescent fungi that cast everything in a sickly green light that made the 7 council members look even more intimidating than usual. High Counselor Grax was the eldest and most powerful of the 7, and he sat on the highest platform, looking down at Vexnar with an expression of cold contempt that would have terrified any other Kelthari. But Vexnar had already learned what real fear felt like, and the disapproval of the council seemed almost gentle compared to the terror of watching his fleet being torn apart by human weapons. "You lost 9 dreadnoughts to a primitive species," Grax said, in a voice that echoed through the vast chamber. "Retreated without completing your mission to conquer their world. And you have brought shame upon the entire Dominion with your failure." "I brought information," Vexnar replied, surprised at how steady his own voice sounded. "And this information may save our civilization if you are willing to listen to what I have learned." "Then explain yourself," Grax commanded, "and tell us why we should not execute you for cowardice and incompetence." Vexnar activated the holographic display in the center of the chamber, and images from the battle appeared in the air, showing Kelthari ships being destroyed by human weapons, while the council watched in silence. "The humans are not what our intelligence reports suggested," he began, "and they are not a peaceful species that stumbled into space travel by accident, because they are predators just like us. But they have developed in ways that we did not anticipate and cannot easily counter, showing a human ship ramming a Kelthari dreadnought at full speed. Their technology is not inferior to ours," he continued, "but it is different, because they took a separate path of development that our ancestors abandoned thousands of years ago. And they refined primitive weapons like kinetic projectiles and nuclear devices to a degree we did not think possible." "Technology can be countered," Grax interrupted impatiently. "And we can adapt our shields to block their weapons and develop new weapons to penetrate their defenses. And then we can return with a larger fleet and crush them properly." "That is not the primary concern," Vexnar said, "because the technology is just a symptom of something deeper. And the real problem is their psychology and the way they think about war and survival." He changed the display to show recordings of human communications that had been intercepted during the battle, and the voices of human officers giving orders and reporting. Damage filled the chamber. "Listen to them carefully," Vexnar said, "because every single one of these humans is terrified, and you can hear the fear in their voices if you pay attention. But they keep fighting anyway, despite their terror." The council members shifted uncomfortably on their platforms, because fear was something they had eliminated from their species, and they did not like hearing about it, or being reminded that it existed. "We removed fear from our genetic code, because we believed it made us weak," Vexnar continued, "and we thought that without fear we would be better soldiers and more efficient conquerors. And in some ways, we were right about this." He paused to let his words sink in, before continuing. "We became disciplined and relentless and willing to fight to the death without hesitation. But we also became predictable. because we fight the same way every time, and we never adapt our tactics because we have no reason to do so. Pulled up more recordings showing human ships performing maneuvers that seemed suicidal but somehow worked. The humans fight with fear as their constant companion, he explained, and this fear makes them creative and desperate and capable of actions we cannot anticipate because we cannot even imagine them. And they will do anything to survive, even if it means dying in the attempt. What kinds of actions? Grax demanded, leaning forward on his platform with interest, despite his obvious skepticism. Vexnar showed the recording of the pilot named Kevin, the young human who had ejected from his destroyed fighter and drifted alone in space until he found a Kelthari supply ship. The council watched in silence as Kevin breached the airlock with his cutting tool and entered the ship alone, armed with nothing but a small gun and a knife, and they watched as he made his way through the vessel to the reactor. 20 minutes later, the supply ship exploded. Kelthari dreadnoughts were damaged by the blast, and Kevin died knowing that his sacrifice had meant something. One human, Vexnar said quietly, alone and afraid and certain he was going to die, destroyed a ship carrying enough supplies to sustain our entire fleet for a month. And this is what fear gives them, because the knowledge that death is coming makes them dangerous beyond anything we have ever faced. The council chamber was completely silent for a long moment. My recommendation, Vexnar said carefully, is that we classify humanity as a Class 7 threat and establish a quarantine around their star system, and we should not engage them or provoke them, and we should let them expand into their local space and hope they never develop the technology to reach ours. Unacceptable, Grax said firmly, because the Dominion does not retreat from lesser species, no matter how dangerous they might seem. We will assemble a proper invasion force of 100 dreadnoughts and crush the humans completely. If you send 100 dreadnoughts, Vexnar replied, they will build 200 ships to fight them, and if you send 1,000 dreadnoughts, they will build 2,000 ships, because the humans will never stop building and fighting as long as they believe their survival depends on it. He met Grax's eyes directly, despite the disrespect this showed. And when they have defeated your invasion fleet, he continued, they will not stop there, because they will follow you back to Dominion space and find Keltar Prime itself, and they will make us pay for every attack we have ever made against them. You are afraid, Brax said with disgust dripping from every word, and fear is weakness, and weakness has no place in the Dominion. Yes, Vexnar admitted, I am afraid, and for the first time in my life I understand why fear exists, and if you were wise, you would be afraid as well. Walked out of the council chamber without waiting to be dismissed, leaving the 7 counselors to debate his fate and the future of the Dominion. Behind him he heard Grax ordering the assembly of the largest invasion fleet in Kelthari history, and he knew that his warnings had fallen on deaf ears because his people had forgotten how to be afraid. The Dominion would send its fleet to Earth, and the humans would be waiting for them, and Vexnar could only hope that some of his people would survive the disaster that was coming. He had tried to save them, but they would not listen, and now they would have to learn the same lesson he had learned in the fires of battle. Fear was not weakness, and the species that had embraced it would prove this to the Dominion in blood and fire and the wreckage of 1,000 ships. Vexnar returned to his quarters and began writing a detailed account of everything he had witnessed and learned, because he knew that someday they, survivors of the coming war, would need to understand what had happened and why. He titled his document, Fear Found Me During My First Battle with Humanity, and hoped that future generations would read it and learn from the mistakes of their ancestors. The Dominion had created an enemy it could not defeat by attacking a species it did not understand, and now the consequences of that mistake would reshape the galaxy forever. 50 years passed after the first battle for Earth, and the galaxy was transformed in ways that no one could have predicted when Vexnar first brought his fleet to the small blue world. The Dominion High Council had ignored every warning and assembled the largest invasion force in Kalthari history. 120 dreadnoughts, carrying 2 million warriors who believed they could not be defeated. They arrived at Earth, expecting to find the same primitive fleet they had faced before. But the humans had spent 5 decades preparing for this moment. The second battle for Earth lasted 12 terrible days, and when it ended, the entire Kalthari invasion fleet had been destroyed, and not a single ship returned to Dominion space to report what had happened. The humans had built faster ships and more powerful weapons and better defenses during those 50 years, and they had studied every recording from the first battle to learn how the Kalthari fought. More importantly, they had not changed who they were, and they still fought with fear in their hearts and desperation in their souls, and this made them impossible to predict and impossible to defeat. Admiral Linda Morgan had retired by the time the second invasion came, but her successor was a battle-hardened commander named Daniel Price, who had studied her tactics and learned her lessons. He understood that the Kalthari would keep coming as long as they believed they could eventually win, so he decided to give them a reason to stop. The United Earth Defense Force launched a counter-invasion, not to conquer Kalthari worlds, but to demonstrate that humanity could strike anywhere at any time, without warning. Human ships appeared at supply depots and destroyed them before disappearing into the darkness, and communication relays were sabotaged across 3 star systems, and military bases were attacked and demolished while the Dominion struggled to respond. Humans did not try to hold territory or establish colonies in Kalthari space, because they did not want to rule the Dominion, and they only wanted to prove that they could hurt their enemies whenever they chose to do so. The message was simple and clear, and even the most stubborn members of the High Council eventually understood what it meant. Leave humanity alone, or suffer the consequences. The Dominion Council was led by younger members now, Kalthari who had grown up hearing stories about the human wars, and who understood that some enemies could not be conquered, no matter how many ships you sent against them. They chose to negotiate, and a treaty was signed that established borders between human and Kalthari space, and both sides agreed to stay on their own side and leave each other in peace. It was not friendship, and it was not alliance, but it was something that might have been called mutual respect if either side had been willing to admit it. Treaty was built on a foundation of mutual fear, because the Kalthari had finally learned to be afraid of humans, and the humans had always known how to be afraid of everything. Vexnar lived long enough to see the treaty signed, though he had been exiled after his testimony to the council, and stripped of his rank, and sent to a remote colony world where he could not cause any more trouble. But he had been right about everything, and everyone knew it, and his writings about the human wars became required reading at Kalthari military academies, where young officers learned about the dangers of underestimating an enemy. His memoir was titled "Fear Found Me During My First Battle with Humanity," and it contained lessons that would be studied for centuries. In the final chapter of his book, Vexnar wrote words that would be quoted by Kalthari scholars and warriors for generations to come. "We believed that removing fear made us strong," he wrote, "but we were completely wrong about this, because fear is not the enemy of courage, and it never was, because fear is the foundation upon which all true bravery is built. Without fear there can be no real courage," he continued, "because courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being afraid, and without that choice there is only recklessness and foolishness." The humans understood this truth that we had forgotten, he wrote, and they embraced their fear and used it and mastered it, and in doing so, they became something that we could never be. They became survivors. We Kalthari are predators, and we hunt and kill and conquer because that is our nature. But predators have a fatal weakness that we never recognized until it was too late. When the hunt goes wrong and the prey fights back, he continued, we do not know what to do, because we have no instinct for retreat and no wisdom that tells us when to withdraw. Simply fight, until we win or until we die. Humans are not predators like us, he wrote, and they are something far more dangerous than any predator could ever be, because they are prey that learn to fight back against every threat they faced. They carry within them 1,000,000 years of running and hiding and surviving against impossible odds, he explained. And their ancestors lived in fear of every shadow and every sound, and this fear made them clever and cautious and incredibly dangerous when cornered. When you threaten what humans love, he warned, they become the most terrifying force in the entire galaxy, because they will sacrifice everything to protect their home and their families and their future. I went to Earth expecting to conquer a primitive species that would submit to our superior power, he concluded, and instead, I learned the most important lesson of my entire life. Some prey should never be hunted. Vexnar died peacefully in his sleep, many years after writing those words. But his legacy lived on in the minds of every Kelthari who read his book and understood its meaning. The Dominion never attacked humanity again, and the borders established by the treaty held firm for centuries, and both species eventually learned to coexist in a galaxy that was big enough for everyone. Fear had found Vexnar during his first battle with humanity, and it had changed him forever. But it had also saved his people from extinction. Because fear was not weakness after all. Fear was wisdom, and wisdom was the key to survival. And the humans had always known this truth that the Kelthari had foolishly forgotten. The galaxy would remember the lesson that humanity taught the Dominion, and no species would ever make the same mistake of underestimating the small blue world called Earth, because the humans were always afraid, and their fear made them invincible.